Good morning and afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. I am Alex Kiani. I'm the Managing Director of the Behavioural Insights team here in APAC. So I'm based in Sydney, but look after our work program in Singapore and Indonesia as well, and across the region. I am really excited to have with us today Dr. Michael Hallsworth, who is our Chief Behavioural Scientist for the team. In fact, Michael and I are, I think, the two longest serving team members here in the Behavioural Insights team. Sadly, Serene Koh, our Director of our Singapore office, isn't able to join us this morning. However, I have many of my colleagues from our Singapore team join us on the chat, and we are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm particularly excited today to have Michael here because he'll be able to talk us through the work that he's been doing and been thinking really deeply about around how we can use behavioral science to increase AI adoption. Now, many governments and organizations across the region have really focused on how we can use AI, but we won't really unlock that power unless we really think about how we can increase adoption. So Michael will bring with him his decades of experience in terms of behavioral science and behavior change, and also brand new insights from the training that he's been running on using BI to increase AI adoption that we've had quite a lot of interest in here in Australia and Singapore. And talk us through, how you can use these tools to increase AI adoption. So I will hand you over to Michael, who joins us from New York, and actually joins us from the 9th of March in the past, whilst we're all living here in the future. But thank you so much for joining us, Michael. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I'm joining you from the evening in New York. And as you can see in my slides, I've just thought it's the 9th. I didn't think, of course, that for my audience, for me, it is the 9th, and for you, it is the morning of the 10th. So bear with me. It's the same time. It's simultaneous. So I want to talk to you about adoption of AI. And I'm going to cover 5 things. I'm going to talk to you briefly and broadly about why behavioral science matters for AI. Why do we care? Is this just a technological solution, really? Second, I'm going to talk about what we mean by adoption. I'm going to give you this brief distinction between shallow and deep adoption that we think is quite helpful. Then we're going to try and understand the challenge here in terms of AI adoption. What do we mean by that? And what are some of the barriers that can get in the way of AI adoption? And then we're going to use behavioral science insights to talk about how we might address some of those barriers. And then finally, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the ways you might do a project to actually implement this stuff in practice. And obviously, things are still moving there, but we have some ideas of what that could look like. So the first thing, why should we care about behavioral science in the context of AI? I think the basic point is that there has been an enormous amount of activity around generative AI in the last few years. People are spending a lot of money, time, attention on how organizations could use AI differently, or they could use it throughout their organizations for maybe mundane tasks, maybe more in-depth ones. Yet we need to think about human behavior as well as technology. There's been a lot of interest on the things that the models can do, and maybe a bit less interest in how people can actually help those models do those things, and some of the barriers that may exist to actual usage by humans. But also, it's not just about usage, it's also about how humans are being influenced by AI, and also how humans are influencing AI in turn. As we have shown in our recent work, there are at least 4 major issues that behavioral science can enhance when it comes to AI. The first one is, how can we build AI better? It may interest you to know that we can use insights from human cognition to actually improve the way that AI works, to build better, more sophisticated AI that can, for example, reflect on its mistakes. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today. Then, in terms of today's talk, we're going to focus on adoption, why people use or resist AI, and how those things can be affected, with the goal that maybe we should get towards a deep adoption in contexts that minimize harm and maximize value. There are also issues around how we can design an AI that works with our psychology, fits with our behaviors, reflects our values. And to do that, we have to get a better understanding of how AI is interacting with us and how this mutual influence between humans and machines can be used for good. And there's a ton of research that's going on right now into understanding exactly how those interactions happen. And then finally, adapt. What are the consequences of all these things at a societal level? How can we evolve as a group of humans to meet the challenges that AI presents? How should we make those decisions? How can we collectively shape our human and AI future? These are all talked about in our AAA report, which you can get by scanning the QR code or searching for it. Today, I'm going to talk about adoption. And I want to start by talking about this continuum, if you like, between shallow and deep adoption. When we think about AI adoption, obviously the first thing to note is that AI can mean various different things. I've got a really simple overview here. You can see the last 10, 15 years as a progression from the left to the right in some ways, from AI that learns rules to creates content to executes tasks. So we start off with machine learning algorithms that could be used to detect patterns and predict behavior in specific instances. Good examples might be using machine learning algorithms to predict who is likely to default on a loan or who had to calculate a premium for car insurance. Now, obviously, these were not uncontroversial in themselves, but they had a more limited application in terms of you train them on behavior to find rules within a particular set of data, and then they made predictions within that space. The rise of ChatGPT and other large language models is reflected in this kind of move to generative AI, where what is produced is content of various kinds, text, images, prompts, text, images, and media are the outputs. We input prompts. We ask them to do things. And essentially what the AI is doing there is making predictions in order to generate that content. So it's a more sophisticated and wide-ranging application of this kind of prediction approach. And obviously it has been used widely for various different purposes. I won't go into it, but the neural networks underpinning the creation of generative AI have some interesting parallels to the way the human brain works as well. And then in just the last year or so, there's been a lot of focus on agentic AI. So the goal here is actually doing things rather than just prompting to create content. We ask agents to do things on our behalf. We try and instruct them, and they go away and try and complete tasks by planning, acting, and self-correcting, learning to use tools. So AI means a few different things. Adoption means a few different things. Although this is changing, you often hear talk as if, have you adopted AI yet? As if it's a binary. We're going to make the obvious point that it's more of a continuum. Just having used AI once is not really the goal that we're looking for. We're looking for a deeper adoption that is more integrated into the core tasks of an organization. Moving, for example, from redrafting an email to actually embedding it in the way you hire people or you form strategy. And that is much less common. You can see in the graphs here, the actual use of embedded AI to do specific tasks in organizations is much lower. The light blue bars are always lower than the dark blue ones. As we move from have organizations investigated these tools to whether they've piloted them, to whether they've successfully implemented them, those numbers go down. Obviously, this is a fast-moving situation. But I think the core insight is that we mean different things by adoption as well, and we should be thinking about this as a continuum towards more integrated and more fundamental changes to organizations. In the report, we kind of set out some of the distinctions here between shallow and deep. Obviously, this is highly simplified. It's not just a straight line between the two, but I want to give you some representative examples here. And you can see things like the move from writing emails to core decision-making support, from using it occasionally in a superficial way to a frequent and proactive one, from standalone tools to integration into workflows, and for some marginal productivity gains to really sort of rethinking how you do things in an organization. You can see the distinction in terms of the outputs between shallow and deep adoption. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side, you can see an example of a shallow adoption that was evaluated in Denmark, 25,000 workers, 11 occupations, didn't see a very big impact on wages or hours worked. In fact, there was just a 2.8% reduction in time worked on average. They concluded that they weren't going to see many increases in productivity unless employers adapt workflows accordingly, which goes back to the point I was just making. On the other hand, in a study with Google, now this was with software engineering, which you could argue is a bit of an easier test case for adopting AI, and indeed has seen a lot of progress. But I think it's worth looking at these numbers regardless, that they found that integrating AI into the workflow, rather than sort of putting it on top, spraying on top, did cut workflow task time by 20%. So there was a deeper, more meaningful contribution of the AI in that instance. We as an organization tried to do this to an extent as well. We've tried to see how AI could be used to do literature reviews, research into existing studies, comparing AI with human reviews, and there are pros and cons of both. We also look at how AI can enhance core interventions like chatbots, policy simulations, and so on. And also, can AI improve the way we recruit? What happens when you give AI the standardized tests that we try to use to recruit people? And we've been doing this for some time, looking to see how we could improve this so we're not just testing the responses that LLMs give, but thinking about the human element here as well. So as an organization, I wouldn't say that we've done everything we can do, and progress is continuing, obviously, but we try to show some of these kind of deeper adoptions ourselves. So what's the problem? You may wonder, because people talk about the massive adoption of AI worldwide. It's really taken off faster than many comparable innovations. What is the issue with adoption? Well, I think, as I hinted, you've got to start thinking about adoption for what? What tasks are we asking AI to do here? There are many of them. I think a pretty good framework for understanding this came out in the Harvard Business Review just a few months ago, and I'm showing it here. It's a fairly simple framework that's a 2x2 that shows different cases for using AI and where you should be more cautious and more forceful. And they make the distinction on the bottom of the table between instances where the cost of errors are low, something is reversible, there's a minor misstep, for example, or the cost of error is high, where there's an irreversible damage to people or legal liabilities and so on. And on the other axis, they talk about explicit data, so things that can be easily coded and structured, easily coded and articulated and documented. versus things that are more tacit and based on the situation, context-specific things that you have to sort of feel, that are hard to explain unless you sort of experience them. And they kind of say that when risks are low, when there's explicit data, then it's pretty obvious that AI should take a lot of those tasks. When there's explicit data and the cost of errors is high, you've got the AI producing the work and the human verifying it, often called human in the loop. When there's tacit knowledge that's hard to kind of codify and it's low risk, then the AI might work by creating options that a human then selects. And in the final quadrant, where it's high risk and it's tacit knowledge, then they say that the human should be leading and doing the heavy lifting and the AI should be the assistant. So I think that's pretty useful, but then you've got to ask yourself, do you want to be a human in the loop? Will your employees want to be a human in the loop? Does it sound like a good deal? Because this is often talked about as like a big function, but let's think about it for a second. In some of the AI literature, there's talk of this idea of a centaur, which is basically a human being who's assisted by a machine. So the body, in the metaphor from mythology, you have the body of a horse and the top half of a human. It allows you to do new things in this metaphor, like run faster, for example. Recently, people have been talking about reverse centaur, which is a machine where the human being is basically the sort of puppet of the machine that tells you what to do. So an example might be, we don't have fully autonomous delivery vehicles in most cases now. So you have a human being driving a delivery van, but that human might be continually surveilled by a camera, saying when that person is spending too long at a particular delivery and being instructed to move on. So you're basically being controlled by the AI and performing these tasks. And unsurprisingly, people don't really like that kind of thing. Or they're in a situation where they are an expert, but they have little agency and they're just overseeing the AI doing a task and taking the blame when things go wrong. They fear being the moral crumple zone, in the phrasing that one researcher uses. So I think we need to think more about the human when we're assuming there will be a human in the loop, and the human behaviors and how they will react. I won't talk about this in much detail because of time, but we also feel differently about different tasks. People seem, at least one framework suggests that we like AI taking on tasks where there's low ambiguity and it's not very relevant to our identity, and dislike it when it's the opposite. And this is about the psychology of what we feel like, which is different from the framework I showed you earlier in terms of what should it be used for. And the result of all this means that you've got different challenges for different sectors. If you're dealing with high status professionals, doctors, lawyers, and so on, then the issue that may come up is a status and self-image threat, kind of reactance to being replaced, or feeling that an AI is providing the core value that I should provide as a professional. And so you might end up with people avoiding things, avoiding AI, restructuring their job to avoid contact with AI. That's quite different from a situation where you have, say, a big bureaucracy, maybe a big government department, maybe a big bank, where the barrier here might be instead friction. It's hard to do things. People are worried about compliance risks of trying out AI. And so they never even get to that point. Maybe they're willing or even keen, but they have these barriers in the way organizationally. And again, that may be different from, say, a knowledge worker, from someone doing marketing, HR, consultants, where they are using AI, but they're using it in fairly superficial ways to do what we call satisficing, to get a good enough product, to get rewrite an email that's good enough, and they don't think about how can we use that in more fundamental ways to go beyond that shallow use. So you can see in different careers in different sectors, you may have these different barriers. As a result, people have been thinking that maybe we need to rethink AI adoption. There are some signs that people are getting discouraged, and maybe that people are using AI in a shadow way outside the formal structures. The conclusion, having looked at this, is the challenge remains the human side of things. That's the key bottleneck. Morale is a continual problem. How you manage people's motivations and so on is really key. That's the conclusion from the latest kind of AI adoption survey. So if we look to the behavioral science side of things, understanding what's going on here, what can we learn? The first thing to say is that some people say that we should think about AI adoption not as a special case, as a potentially superhuman intelligence, but we should think about it in terms of any other technology as well. Think about how it may be similar to previous technologies. And certainly when I teach my class at the University of Pennsylvania, we look at the parallels between other adoptions of technology in the past, and there are some common themes that emerge. You often see awareness preceding adoption by several years. You see common barriers around friction and status quo. What changes quite often is the social proof, the sense that other people are using technology. And deeper adoption requires institutional support rather than just individuals. Otherwise, you won't get that change. And just to flag that we're not the only ones that have been thinking about this. There is many existing research that has looked into technological adoption. What we think we can add here is identifying these 3 factors that seem to really affect employee adoption of AI. And those 3 are motivation, capability, and trust. So for motivation, do people see a clear, desirable reason to use AI? Do they see why it could benefit them or their organization? What's the motivation? Second, capability. Are people able to use AI effectively and confidently? Do your perceived abilities, what you think you can do, match your real abilities? And then trust. How do you feel about AI? Do you think it's a threat? Do you think it's a friend? Do you think it's reliable? If you look at the data, these 3 factors explain a lot of the barriers, a lot of the concerns that people talk about. The top 3 concerns that are slowing AI adoption are the unclear use case. So people don't see why it's helpful. They don't have motivation. They have legal, compliance, or privacy concerns. They are not sure they trust the technology. And they lack the training or the right knowledge and skills, the capability issue. If you just focus on people who don't use AI in organizations, you see similar patterns. In fact, the main factor is they don't believe AI can assist with the work they do. Now, it may be that they're right. It will have different effects throughout the organization. But I think as someone thinking about AI, you need to assess whether that is actually the case and whether there is a motivation gap and how that can be addressed. We set it out like this, bringing it all together. We think there are motivation, capability, and trust barriers moving from no adoption to shallow adoption, and from moving from shallow adoption to deep adoption. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but in terms of the motivation barriers, when you're moving from no to shallow adoption, simply may not be salient to people what the benefits are. You may not have the clear win when you've got lots of little improvements in productivity. And the status quo bias will remain quite strong. People will often stick to what's known, even though they know an alternative is better, because we're effort minimizers, and that's a fairly obvious point. And in terms of the movement from shallow to deep adoption, it's this satisficing problem as well. What's the actual incentive to push through from a good enough use to a great use? With capability, often it's about friction. It's often about cognitive load, too many things for people to do, and often about a lack of preferring known kind of risks to the what we don't know. Like the fact that the technologies seem to be changing very quickly means that people don't even understand what the gap is in their capability, and that can lead to just avoidance. And finally, trust. We know that in many cases there is a psychological threat, existential concerns about your future, often conflicting signals from leaders about whether AI is okay, for what it is, for what uses, and when, for whom. And then also there's the idea of permission bias, which Richard Thaler, the co-author of Nudge, often talks about, that people often feel that they need permission to do things. The default is rarely that you can just do things. In an organization, you feel that the bias is on the side of somebody needs to tell me I can do it before I'll do it. How do we address these barriers? I'm going to give you a brief overview of the main research findings right now that I hope will be helpful to you. So you bear in mind the motivation, capability, and trust framework here. I'm going to try and give you some highlights that will address these barriers. First step, of course, is identifying which ones are most relevant to your organization. So the first one is social norms that we often talk about in behavioral science. Just highlighting successful peer usage can be helpful. When people hear that others have successfully used AI chatbot without issues, it increases people's perception of the benefits. Very basic. People are more likely to use an algorithm when doing their job if they're told most other people are already using the algorithm. So some of these classic insights we talk about do seem to transfer to the AI space. And when we're talking about this slightly different idea of regret aversion, people worry that they're going to regret doing something or not doing something. Well, that's much higher when people feel they're going against the dominant norm. So again, what people are doing changes the perceived costs and benefits for you. Interesting study about loss aversion. So this was in a lab. So you need to think about how this translates or not to an organization. But in this study, people were asked to complete a task with either human or AI assistance. When people were rewarded for a correct answer, they were preferred human help, even though the AI was shown to be more accurate. Whereas when people were in a loss frame situation, when they started with $10 and lost money for each mistake, they valued the AI assistance just as much as the humans. So that leads to the interesting idea that framing AI as a tool to prevent errors or mitigate risk, rather than just a tool to achieve gains and do things better, could mean that people are more willing to adopt it. Again, I think this is something that needs to be explored in the particular context, but this study was kind of interesting and suggestive in that regard. Giving people some agency, allowing them to personalize and co-design their experience with AI can increase the feeling of control and the feeling of that this is something that is relevant to you. So that kind of personalization really helps if it's co-designed with employees, involving people in what their job could look like in this kind of AI future. But I think also the caveat is that you need to structure this as a positive thing. So it's using AI to structure your roles so you can do more, you can achieve more, deepen those kind of relationships, rather than shaping your job so you can avoid AI and insulate yourself from it. I think there's a role to create structured opportunities for people to use AI. So some organizations have done short-term competitions like innovation tournaments, rewarding experimentation with AI. The idea is that tries to change the perception of doing different things as just like something that a few creative people do. So this is more trying to get ideas for AI use from across the organization and then sort of taking them down to finalists. showing that those ideas can come from anywhere, and that AI can be something that you can use to come up with things that are then rewarded. Similarly, organizations have experimented with sandboxes where AI can be used by employees on work time for different purposes that they set, giving that kind of control and allowing people to see what can be done. And I think this is particularly relevant for some of the latest models, where you just may not realize what some of the frontier models can do for you, that they can create your slides for you, they can create bespoke websites for you instantly. And people may only really connect with that when it's something that is a use they're passionate about. Then let's think about the adoption journey, how we can scaffold the adoption journey. And that's basically helping people get a leg up, a support at each stage, step-by-step tasks, starting with the tasks that are lower risk and more visible and more immediate, and then building on what you've learned there to go to more complex supervised tasks. So building on those skills step by step, rather than just expecting people to leap to the most sophisticated uses that I just mentioned around, creating new websites or interactive prototypes, which you can use with the latest models. Not everyone's going to go there straight away. And when you're thinking about scaffolding, you may just think in terms of making things really easy to start with. We showed in an experiment with an AI chatbot that we ran a couple of years ago that this really makes a difference. Just making the chatbot more prominent, giving more space on the screen for people to use it, increased usage. So you may start in your scaffolding journey by removing those barriers. Of course, that's not going to get you the whole way to more sophisticated and deeper adoption, but it'll be the starting point. And when you're on that journey, think about tipping points. So Microsoft have this study, which sounds a bit too good to be true, where they sort of say that when using AI, there's a point where 11 minutes of daily time savings is the point at which people suddenly think, which the improvements from AI start to become visible. People start to notice the improvements. And they also say that it takes 11 weeks of consistent use to experience the difference that AI can bring. Again, it sounds a bit too neat, but I think the underlying point here is that the journey is not on a continuous progress. You can have a sudden discontinuous leap in awareness, understanding, ability. Can we identify when those points are likely to occur and get people closer to them? So they can actually make that leap to AI becoming habitual and saving them time, and in a visible way that becomes self-sustaining. A core part of this is understanding what's going on in the organization. You can get real-time feedback from quick trials. And if people are skeptical, then actually providing that kind of test can be a good way of addressing skepticism. If it's not just seen as pure hype and just trying to force it on people, but a more mature understanding of where it can and can't add value and a quantification of that, that can be a more sustainable way forward. And this does happen. So there are experiments going on in organizations all the time, and they can be surprising. And this one I'm showing you on the slide, run by Brian Jabarian, who's currently at University of Chicago, found that AI-led interviewers actually had a more positive experience for interviewees and produced better outcomes, which is not what you might expect. And then finally, leaders matter. We know this, but there's also data to support this. There's a Gallup study showing that manager support has the strongest association with measurable differences in how employees use and value AI. if you strongly agree that your manager supports your team's use of AI, you're 2.1 times more likely to use AI a few times a week or more. So modeling that behavior, or the signals you're sending of like, oh yeah, it's all nonsense, don't worry about AI, versus this can help you in these particular ways and it's kind of a real thing, that's going to make a big difference. I'm going to end by talking about ways forward. Obviously, these things are still emerging. We talk about the 3 phases of diagnosing, designing, and deepening when it comes to AI adoption. And this is different from our standard way of doing things because we explicitly want to look at this deepening and embedding it into organizations. You diagnose what's going on in the organization. You use the framework I just mentioned around capability, motivation, trust, shallow, deep, and deep adoption to look at where the problems are, to look at people's motivation, capability, and trust, to try and understand where the barriers are in your organization. You can then come up with some changes based on some of the studies I just mentioned. You can prototype them so they fit your organization, do some small scale pilots. You can get ideas from employees about what is the pipeline of things to test in the future. And then you try to look how those benefits are playing out in practice. What are the unintended consequences in your organization? How can you build on those successes if they come along to get to the kind of use that really adds more value for your organization? So those 3 stages can make it all real, can bring it together. I say this is exciting work that's still happening. There's much we don't know, but we also have a framework for understanding the different factors. And if you'd like to know more, we're happy to take questions in this webinar, but also please feel free to give us an email. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating talk and lots of different examples there and studies demonstrating some of the key points and lessons that you pulled together in that paper with Liz and Dylan. We've got lots of questions coming through and we will get to them in a second, but I'm going to take the chair's privilege and ask you a couple of questions to start off with. So the first one is around shadow use. So basically the idea that employees or people in an organization are using it without explicit organizational permission. I think Australia and Singapore consistently rank among some of the highest countries for that shadow use. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, if you were a leader in an organization, a CTO, CPO, or even just a manager, how would you view that shadow use if you were hoping to ultimately increase adoption?
I think it depends what your risk tolerance is. I actually would, look, it's easy for me to say I wouldn't be that bothered because I'm not running the organization. And it depends what your business is. I think the big difference that I'm aware of is that for enterprise use, your data is not used to train the model. So I think in Gemini Enterprise, for example, that is an explicit part of the deal. Whereas personal use, I believe, even for the higher cost plans, that could be a case. So the use of your data is different. And I think as a leader, I would be a bit concerned about that. But I think it also depends if people are using it for more less sensitive things, then I think that could be a useful stepping stone. Of course, remember that some of the benefits come through being able to use the same tools. They're kind of network effects, because ideally we want people working together on these things. So if people are using different tools, then that's not possible. So it's definitely not ideal. But I think trying to stamp it out completely can lead to mixed messages down the line.
Cool. Thank you very much. And I'll ask one last question before we go to the many that are coming through here. So there have been some recent examples, actually largely in Australia, where managers have used one of their trusty tools in their toolkit, which are KPIs. So Telstra, who are a national telco here, basically KPI AI use for their employees. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how you might, whether that's a good use of sort of the managerial toolkit, or what the risks and dangers might be associated if not.
So I lost you the first part. What's the use of the API, do you say, Alex?
So a KPI, so a key performance indicator for AI use. Is that a good idea when it comes to AI adoption or not?
I think it can be gamed, and I think the obvious thing you do there is just like very superficial use. So I would be a bit cautious about that as an indicator, because really the end point is not to use AI, it's to use it for a particular purpose. So I know that feels like a temporary thing which you might need to get people's attention, but by no means should it be a longer term metric in my mind.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we've had loads of questions and keep them coming in. I'll hand over to Penny Rush, who here's the question. So Penny's joining us from NAM or Melbourne, saying, do you know if there's any frameworks that have been developed for adoption by sector?
So great question off the top of my head. I think this is moving very quickly. So I think, yes, there have been. And certainly people are focusing on issues like education versus healthcare. These are very different areas. So I know that the kind of the epistemic status of different different what am I saying here? Different sectors like medicine, for example, mean that you do need different approaches. In terms of like what are the best ones, it's fluid. I can't. It's hard for me to point to different ones, and there are just so many different sectors. But yes, that is happening, because people are recognizing that point I made earlier about professions differ, and they'll have different barriers, and AI needs to do different things. So if that's not too vague an answer, it's happening, and I think that is probably a good thing.
Cool, thank you. Another question here from Johnny Rogers says, what are your favorite examples of organizations creating safe sandboxes or low risk spaces for staff to experiment with AI?
Yeah, unfortunately, the organizations don't talk about them so much. So I know that, like I showed in the slide, Harvard did it, and I think Thomson Reuters did it, and they said they did it. I know that certainly, for example, I've done it when we have plenty of studies that we run a bit, and we've had a limited amount of research capability, and there are really fascinating questions about, for example, we did a study on how LLMs can reduce our own cognitive biases, and there were so many avenues I wanted to take, but I didn't have, the people in the research team were too busy. Claude Code can do that now. I can spend some time with Claude Code, and it's like having a specialist researcher. So I've been doing that in terms of exploring new routes to that data we did last summer, which we just didn't have the resource to go into more deeply. So I've got I feel like my own sandbox there. Alex, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, anyone's on the call from my team here, we do encourage a lot of experimentation here. And I think that's it. I mean, I think the key thing that we can see is allowing teams to play around is really, really important. But I think it's also recognizing that there can be this sort of valley of death scenario where there are good use cases that don't make it through the organization. So what we can see quite a lot in the data is that organizations at the senior levels, they're really, really excited to use AI, right? So in your C-suite and maybe a couple of levels below that, everyone's super excited about it. But then underneath that level, there's sort of this permafrost. And that's partly due to the messaging in the, we've got organizations explicitly saying that this is just a productivity measure and we want to be really efficient. Which, if you're a junior staff or a grad, then either you could be really excited by AI, or you could feel like you're essentially asking us as turkeys to vote for Christmas. So I think it's important to have those sandboxes, but it's also really important to consider what that innovation pipeline is to get to scale, which is where models like the Everett Rogers diffusion of innovation sort of book, and it's got like 3 different toolkits in there, I think are really, really important. I think the analogy to other technologies is important. Oh, so Anthony Ferry asks, does this framework that's been outlined, does it apply globally? Or do you have to adjust it for local country-specific impact or cultural considerations?
Do you mean, Anthony, which framework do you mean? Do you mean the AAA one or the Motivation Capability Trust one? I can try and answer for both. I mean, I think both of them are sufficiently high level that they are fairly widely applicable. When we think about capability, motivation, trust, those are fairly fundamental drivers. We selected trust because we often think about capability, opportunity, and motivation. The trust issue obviously is going to be dependent on some historical and cultural factors, like what was done previously, what narratives do people have about AI, about the people running their organization. So that's going to vary quite a bit. That's the one that comes to mind. The high level one of AAA, I think, is widely applicable because that's very much linked with the technology itself. So yeah, trust is the thing I would think about most in terms of adjusting, and got to be really sensitive to what people think about when they hear AI and what to think about when they hear organizational change.
And presumably that will change over time as well, right? So the context from 2024 will be different to now. Awesome. So another question here. So what is your view on how AI solution providers are pushing out their products and extent that they are incorporating BI in their suite as the default to help customers overcome such adoption barriers?
I've got mixed feelings about it. I think it's fine if it's, well, how do I put this? I think the problem can be that they bundle less effective options, which make people think AI is no good. So if you're forced to use a particular one and it's not the best one, and it's behind the other models, the capabilities, then you're going to have a particular view of AI capabilities. So yes, you might get into a kind of shallow adoption, but you might get stuck there. And so I really am not sure it's the best option. I know why people are doing it. I know why large organizations are doing it, but I think it can backfire.
Actually, that's a really interesting. I mean, this is something that we've seen quite a lot with enterprise agreements, particularly with government, where Gemini or Copilot is your default, sort of learning from the Internet Explorer bag of tricks, right? In terms of identifying what the effective use cases are there. Yeah. Fantastic. So here, another question. I recognize AI can do lots of great things. However, with the current excitement around AI, how can organizations and leaders ensure genuine value-adding applications instead of just following the hype?
I agree. I mean, in a way, this is the most important question, isn't it? So I'm going to say some very obvious things, like the use of AI for its own sake is not obviously a good thing. Like, so it doesn't necessarily create value. If people are just thinking in sort of sense of mimetic, like I've got to copy another organization, as often happens, and yet they don't have a clear idea of why they're doing it, then that's obviously going to be a problem. I think there is a need to be upfront about the limitations as well, and for leaders to educate themselves about what limitations are, and also what the benefits are, and how quickly things are moving. So we've seen a massive step forward in the frontier models in the last 2 to 3 months. I don't think it's helpful for leaders to give a kind of purely cynical view of AI and say it's all just pattern recognition and next word prediction, because really it isn't anymore. There is, that's the basis of a lot of the large language models, but they have improved a lot. So I think there has been a lot of hype, obviously, with the idea that it's going to replace lots of jobs. You saw what Salesforce did early on. I am just counseling people to do good strategy, thinking about their position in the market, thinking about their functions that they perform, and then looking at what AI is likely to be able to do in the near future based on what it does now, and making the best possible bet on that, as opposed to just reading stuff on LinkedIn and going, it's completely, it's a panacea for my organization's problems. But I don't think that's specific to AI. I think that's true for most technologies. It's just there's a lot of, obviously, hype around AI right now.
Cool. Thank you. The next question there is, what is your advice for organizations to maximize the ROI, the return on investment, when it comes to measuring the success of AI adoption?
Is your question, how can it seem like you've got the maximum return on investment, or is it just how do you measure if value is being created, then what's the best way of capturing it? If it's the second one, I don't think there's a look. So there are two ways of thinking about this broadly. One is that you can minimize the amount of time required to do an existing task. So that's the efficiency argument. And I think you should be looking for efficiency metrics, absolutely, because it is definitely true that AI can make things a lot faster. I think when you do that, you should also ideally factor in reliability. It's hard to do because how do you measure like one or two costly errors, for example? But I think there's basically the efficiency paradigm. And then the second one is trying to capture the value from new paradigm shifting uses of AI. It's much harder, partly because of the time horizon. Like when do those value, when does that value play out? But also it's just harder to, I think, measure the feeling of the intangible sense of this is a completely new product line for us, or completely new way that people see our company. Alex, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, a lot of the conversation has been on productivity and efficiency. I think that a big part of that discussion actually misses the fact that in most systems, whatever output that you create is an input to another part of the system, right? So we can see this really clearly in anyone who's put a job out recently, is that the number of AI job ads that you get through, can swamp you. So I think we need to think really carefully about just thinking about productivity through this narrow lens, because we need to adjust what our whole systems look like and how we will deal with AI. I actually think some of the interesting use cases that we're looking at locally is how do you help people make better decisions? Because essentially you're helping them pass large bits of information really, really quickly and effectively, and really thinking about what the behavioral interface is and how do you mitigate some of those biases that you talked about, Michael, earlier, allows you to really think about what your return on investment could be much more broadly than the LinkedIn chat, noting that we are currently broadcasting on LinkedIn. So this is a good LinkedIn chat. I think we've got time for one last question, and then we will need to wrap up. So here from Victoria saying, how do you assess the threat people or employees feel when there is the actual possibility of needing different skills and for staff to attend to these new paradigms?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. How can you assess it? I mean, I think this is also where it's a question of good management and trying to understand what you want from your employees and how the morale of your employees affects your organization. Because let's face it, there is a real threat quite often. And so people have a reason to be concerned. Like some of the arguments about AI disruption may be true. I I think there's some data that people feel more concerned about their careers when, in terms of AI, when they're less sure about their careers in general. So I think providing some clarity on the stuff you can about what will remain important for your organization seems like good management, but it's hard, isn't it? Because there is a lot of uncertainty going on here. So I think this just goes into a general question about good management of your organization, and it's not particularly specific to AI. It's just AI is something that is generally in the news, creating an unsettling environment. So I think this is where the being a good manager and having the skills and listening to your organization will pay off. Sorry, that's quite a generic answer, but I think it's probably true.
I think it's a fundamental answer, right? I mean, I really like your example of basically getting people to look at their job descriptions and then think about what would it be like with an AI-enabled world. I mean, the number of people that actually look at their job descriptions full stop is probably quite limited. So if anyway, this could be a forcing function to enable better management and better strategy. Obviously, the behavioral insights lens there is critical. But I just want to say thank you to you, Michael, for a fascinating hour-long discussion. And thank you for everyone joining us. As I mentioned, we will be sending through some more details on how you can get in contact with our team who are based across the APAC region. So feel free to reach out to us, and obviously we can share some of the latest learnings that we've had in Australia, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Singapore, and the wider region. So thank you again, and we look forward to hearing from you.